Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Okay, welcome to this keynote session, Capitalism, what is it good for? My name is Dolan Cummings. And it's almost 20 years since capitalism was seemingly triumphant over the historic alternative of communism. Since then, there have been certain ambiguities about whether capitalism is a good thing, whether it can be improved. And of course, in recent months with the financial crisis, there are serious questions being raised about whether capitalism actually works even. Never mind whether there might be alternatives. But I think we all know why we're here, so I won't labour the point. Let me introduce the panel. First to speak, on my immediate right, is Paul Ormerod, an economist and author most famously of Death of Economics, Butterfly Economics, and Why Most Things Fail. He's also the director of Volterra Consulting, a management consultancy based in London. Second, on the far right, is Professor Sanjaya Baru, visiting professor at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, and a former media advisor and spokesman for Dr. Manmohan Singh, who is the Prime Minister of India. Sanjaya is also the author of The Strategic Consequences of India's Economic Performance. Third to speak on the far left, although certainly not politically, is Phillip Blond, a senior lecturer in philosophy and theology at the University of Cumbria. For now, he is considering his options, having had many job offers lately. He's the author of Red Tory, a book about radical conservatism, which will soon be out. And then finally, on my immediate left, is Professor Frank Furedi, Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent, and author of The Politics of Fear, Where Have All the Intellectuals Gone?, Invitation to Terror, and Paranoid Parenting, among others. So, Paul, what is capitalism good for?
Well, thanks very much. Can I start off by saying I very much approve of capitalism, but I'm by no means a free market economist. In fact, as Dolan said, I've written 3 books which are very critical of free market economics. And it seems to me the fundamental problem of free market economics in the textbooks is that it offers a very poor description of how capitalism actually operates. Because in fact, it's precisely at times when people try to get it to behave like a Platonic idea of a free market that capitalism gets into trouble. We've had a couple of recent examples. There was Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, a disastrous experiment in textbook free market economics. And now we've got the example of the current financial crisis, which has essentially arisen because people started to think that a price could be set for absolutely everything, just like the economic textbooks say. But yes, capitalism is a market-oriented system, but there's a profound difference between a market-oriented system and a free market one. The market orientation is a tremendous strength of capitalism. But the untrammeled operation of markets is almost always moderated. It's mediated by social norms, by conventions, by institutional structures, by rules and regulations. This is the setting in which most markets operate under capitalism, and in which capitalism operates most of the time. And in general, it works well. And it's when people lose sight of this and need to mediate the workings of the pure free market that we get problems. Now, of course, the current financial crisis is prominent in people's minds, but the history of capitalism has seen many such crises, hundreds of such crises. I mean, it's really only in the last decade that certain politicians and policymakers deluded themselves that there weren't going to be any more. So what I really want to do is to take a longer perspective on what's happened under capitalism, see what it's really been good for. And so to see what's happened over a long period, smoothing out any individual boom or bust. And in fact, I want to go back to 1900, over 100 years ago, and see what changes have taken place. So what has capitalism ever done for us? Well, apart from delivering higher living standards, greater leisure time, increased life expectancy, lower infant mortality, you know, pretty trivial things like this, the answer is not much, a bit like the Romans in the life of Brian. So I want to I'm an economist, so I've got to put some facts to back these assertions up. So let's start with material living standards. Since 1900, in Britain, living standards have increased 5 times. We were the richest country then. They've increased nearly 8 times in America. In India, they've risen over 4 times, most of which has taken place since India started to embrace capitalism as late as the 1980s. South Korea is going through a crisis at the present time. But compared to 1900, its income per head is nearly 20 times higher. And all these figures take account of inflation. These are real increases in people's prosperity. So capitalism delivers the goods, but it also delivers on the finer things in life, like leisure time. Now, my granddad left school at 1909, it is true, to work in the mill. Now, he was 12, and he was entirely typical of his generation. And in present day, nearly 50% of young people don't leave the education system until they're 21. Now, whether you think of time spent in education as leisure or not, it's a lot better than going into the mill or down the pit at the age of 12. And of course, retirement ages have come down dramatically as well. So more time for people both at the beginning and the end of their lives. And there's also much more leisure time while people are at work. The average person in the West, and I'm not talking about investment bankers here, though their leisure time's rising pretty quickly at the moment. Now, the average person now works barely half of the annual hours which he or she did back in 1900. There have been big increases in holiday entitlements and very sharp reductions in the average working week. And this is true even in the United States. Now let's think about life expectancy. Now in 1900, a white child born in America could expect to live to be 50. It's not very old these days. The life expectancy of a black child was only 34. But now it's 78 for whites and 73 for blacks. So we've seen dramatic rises in both groups and a spectacular narrowing of racial inequality. In 1900, infant mortality in America was 124 per thousand. 1 in 8 children died in infancy. It was 140 per thousand in Britain. And now the figures are just 7 and 5 per thousand respectively. It's really, it's an unusual tragedy when a child dies at infancy now. So in both material well-being, the quality and length of life, capitalism delivers. It's the only socio-economic system that humans have ever invented which delivers such a cornucopia of good things. No other system, hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, feudalism, socialism, you name it, has ever come remotely close to performing as spectacularly well as capitalism. But now, a crucial feature of capitalism is it gives its decision makers, individuals, people in this room, firms, lots of freedom to decide for themselves. This is a great strength. It means people can experiment, can try different ways of doing things, see what works, what doesn't. Most things fail, sometimes spectacularly, as we see in the current financial crisis. But invention and innovation are the key to healthy, dynamic societies and economies. And a willingness to challenge existing orthodoxies and the freedom to do so, this is what capitalism both provides and encourages, as well as, I've already said, trivial things like better living standards, more leisure time, and longer life. All this is what capitalism is good for. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. And Sanjaya Baru.
Thank you. Well, this is not going to be much of a battle of ideas. I actually agree with whatever he has said. I don't know whether my other panelists are going to disagree. I've been on an earlier panel, and I'm afraid we agreed on most issues there as well. So I'm hoping we will have someone disagreeing with us. I will take off from where the earlier speaker left off. I agree with him that I think capitalism has delivered on a variety of fronts, and the most important, in my judgment, is really individual enterprise. But I think, let me first begin by saying that there is capitalism and capitalism. There isn't one unique model. And capitalism, in some of its variants, has delivered a lot of repression. Capitalism in the fascist phase in Germany, in the interwar period, was not particularly nice. Capitalism of the crony variety, the crony capitalism that you see in many parts of the developing world, is not particularly nice. It results in, it's based on a lack of transparency, lack of political transparency in a lot of the decisions that get taken. Command capitalism, if you like, which is what I believe we see today in China, in which there is a centralized command, in which capitalism is essentially, the economy is based on the principles of capitalism, but there is no individual enterprise. On the other hand, you have the state directing the functioning of markets, has also its limitations. Though it's delivered very high on growth, China has done remarkably well in terms of economic growth and lifting people above poverty, but it hasn't done much for individual enterprise. I think the variant of capitalism that I find most appealing is really entrepreneurial capitalism. Most people associate capitalism with markets, so you say free market capitalism. But markets have been there even in pre-capitalist systems, and markets are there in post-capitalist systems or non-capitalist systems. China called itself a socialist market economy, though it was essentially a command capitalist system. I think what is really appealing to a person like me from a developing country is the fact that capitalism has unleashed individual enterprise. You see enormous upward social mobility, particularly in a country like mine, there's India, where we have had centuries of very rigid caste systems and very little upward social mobility. In the last 60 years, in the framework of free markets and capitalism, you've seen a huge upward social mobility of people, because ultimately the cutting edge of capitalism is the ability of people to innovate, to make money, to sell, to create demand for their products, for their brain power, for their the resources that they are able to put out into the market. So therefore, it has enormous social benefits which I would emphasize. And therefore, entrepreneurial capitalism, and I think enterprise is a key element of capitalism that one must recognize. And where there isn't entrepreneurial capitalism, where you have capitalism but without individual enterprise, where kind of highly organized systems like in a fascist or a social market economy, I'm afraid the benefits of the system, benefits of capitalism are limited. The second point I agree with him is that capitalism has been prone to crisis again and again. But so have most other systems been as well. And the difference so far, at least in the last 200-300 years history of capitalism, is capitalism has survived its crises. Many feudal economies succumbed under the pressure of their crises. Socialism certainly has collapsed in the Soviet Union under pressure of crisis. So the fact that capitalism has survived crisis is, I think, something which we should understand is what gives it strength. Now, why have capitalist economies survived crises? I think the fundamental reason is really liberal democracy. The fact that most successful capitalist economies work within the framework of a liberal democracy creates internal checks and balances. So what are in the current context, when everybody is worried about the crisis, I think the three simple lessons that we should draw from the experience of capitalism are summed up in three proverbs, which I learned as a student, very typical English proverbs. 1, a stitch in time saves 9. 2, don't cry over spilt milk. And 3, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think if you look at the last crisis that England was enveloped by, I was mentioning in the earlier session, that Keynes, who brought not just Britain but the entire Western world out of a crisis, was seen as a savior. In many ways, when I see, I was teasing Martin Wolf earlier this afternoon, that when I see him on the front page of FT every morning holding forth on the solutions to the problem, I'm reminded of, a guru. Every morning we have, I don't know if you have here, but we have religious channels. Every morning you have these gurus coming and giving you religious advice, do your yoga, do your exercise, pray to God. I think economists are today the saviors of the current phase, just as Keynes was. And I think that is the strength of capitalism, that it has been able to create social psychoanalysts. Like each of us in a crisis goes to a doctor, capitalism has been able to produce its doctors. And I think that is what has helped the system every time it gets into, just like each of us have illnesses. We know how to live a healthy life, and yet you have influenza, you have coughs and colds, you have a flu or whatever. But the difference is that you know how to solve the problem. And I think that is the real appeal of the system, that it has been able to create an internal dynamic that sustains itself, and a science of its functioning that enables us to correct those mistakes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, capitalism will sort itself out. Phillip, Blond.
Okay. Can I do this if I stand up? I think this is a bit strange. It seems very clear that in history there's never been just capitalism. There has always been means by those, or if there has been capitalism, there's always been those structures and means by which the growth it's generated has tried to be distributed to more people. So the difference between 1900 and now hasn't just been capitalism being wonderful, it's also been the trade union movement. It's also been organised collective struggles by workers to get a higher share of GDP. And I say this as a conservative, I'm not of the left. So what's interesting to me is that actually few of these analyses really get to the heart of the issue. Now, I'm in favour of markets, and I'm in favour of markets because they're efficient, they're effective, and they're a good means of distributing growth. But let's be very clear. If you just have markets, you have monopolies. Capitalism really, if we can define it in the following manner, is monopoly accrual. And monopoly accrual leads to the dispossession of everybody else. And the idea that it's correct to just have unrestrained markets is nothing other than the idea that it's fine to have oligarchs and the production of oligarchical or monopoly capitalism. Let me give you some examples. If you go onto the ONS national website and you look at the percentage share of the wealth held by the bottom half of the British population, that's the bottom 50%. In 1976, that was 12% of the wealth. So 1976, 12% of the wealth, excluding property, so that's wages, savings, any other form of income. That's all the bottom half had. By 2003, that had fallen to 1%. It's all on the ONS website. So what you have actually seen over the last 30 years is the complete destruction of the bottom half of the population's savings, the value of their wages, and their ability to participate in the market. Indeed, as a percentage share of GDP, the greatest share that workers ever attained was, roughly speaking, between 45 and 73. After 73 up till now, the share of GDP that ordinary wage workers have gained has fallen or stagnated, depending where you are. For skilled manual labourers in America, their wages are 15% less in real terms than they were 10 years ago. Moreover, we've seen the population being subject to a massive monopoly advantage towards the top 10%. Everybody else has had to do lots of different things in order to keep ahead. Fundamentally, the growth period of the last 30 years has been financed by people working longer hours, the entry of women into the compulsory entry of women into the workforce in order to make ends meet, and the massive explosion of credit. Furthermore, there's the Kmart effect, which is the idea that the expanding economies have essentially produced consumer durables that mean that for people who shop at Kmart or Asda, the price of their unit goods is actually much lower. Moreover, on the rise of the BRICS is more important on the macroeconomic level because they bought our government bonds. The emerging economies bought British government debt, so enabling long-term interest rates and therefore short-term interest rates to be low. That was the paradigm. So the logic of the last 30 years, the logic of liberalisation, of capital qua capital, has been dispossession of ordinary people. People, in order to get ahead because their wages haven't equalled enough, have had to go into housing and mortgage themselves to the hilt to enter the only asset economy that could deliver them anything. And now, in my view, we're about to enter an unprecedented decade of deflation. And if the evidence from Japan is any example, they still haven't got out of it. So what's actually happened in capital qua capital is that people have been dispossessed and plunged into debt. Now, what I want to suggest to you is what's missing in the previous analyses is the idea that people were in favour of growth, but they organised themselves differently and constructively, so they got a share of that growth, whether it be organised action or even the revival of cooperatives or guilds in the 19th century, which then became the trade union movement. What I want to suggest to you is something sort of going further back. And I say this from the perspective of somebody who believes in a civic economy, believes in markets, but not capitalism, believes, like Browdell, that you can separate monopoly capitalism, which is what we've been practiced, from the civic operation of markets. Now, in essence, I'm giving you a theological critique of what's been happening. As no doubt many of you will know, probably the greatest Marxist historian is Brenner. Just did a brilliant book called Merchants and Revolution. He did the great book on agrarian capitalism. And Brenner's Marxist thesis is that capitalism begins in England. And it begins in England with the enclosure movement. Essentially a primary form of dispossession whereby peasants are driven off the land, so they're driven away from subsistence forms of living. And peasants in the Middle Ages in Britain, after the Peasants' Revolution, experienced what Poston, is a famous medieval historian, calls a golden age for workers, or the peasant class. They had 4 or 5 different terms of income. They were self-sufficient. There wasn't beggary as we know it today. In fact, beggary only emerged in the Tudor period, which is when the enclosures began. What happens then, according to Brenner's thesis, is that and he doesn't explain quite why, is that the lords drove the peasants off the land, and those peasants became the proletariat in the cities, and the land accrual and the profits generated therefrom then allowed the development of industrial capitalism on the basis of agrarian capitalism. But what Brenner doesn't mention is the economy that was destroyed. And the economy that was destroyed in medieval Europe was a Catholic economy. And in part, what I want to suggest to you is a Catholic economy is what we actually need. Because both secular forms of liberation that we've been promised are both disastrous. The left has been disastrous and the right has been disastrous. Let me tell you why. Okay, from the perspective, I'm building on the insights of the great Edwardian Catholic thinkers, Belloc and Chesterton. And according to Belloc, especially really Belloc, the real change is that both socialism and capitalism dispossess. Socialism dispossesses because it dispossesses the ordinary worker for the sake of the general good. Capitalism dispossesses because it dispossesses the ordinary worker for the sake of the monopolising capitalist. And so, in effect, what you produce is there are 2 systems of dispossession. The post-war settlement, the welfare state settlement, is nothing other than a left-wing acceptance of the dominance of monopoly capitalism. In Belloc's book, The Servile State, he talked about how people who think themselves radical have essentially accepted welfarism, pursued via the state, as a means to buy off their legitimate demands for a share of the wealth. So in Belloc's thesis, what you have on the left is a left committed to essentially a servile as a serf, a servile relationship via welfare, and on the right, you still have a commitment to monopoly accrual. And indeed, you could probably even argue that this is true of Keynes. So what we need to, and this, I think, this collusion between left and right has in fact been mirrored in our own day. So what we actually have is the left producing monopolies, transferring them to the right, producing monopolies again. You have state protection of expropriating markets. Therefore, the real key and the real task and the real future is to invent a new economic and social model. And part of that must be a civic conservatism. By conservative, I mean the notion of a widely distributed property and assets for all, which is the distributist thesis, which actually could be a left-wing or right-wing thesis, and then the ordo-liberal critique of neoliberalism. And the ordo-liberal critique of neoliberalism is that what's actually happened is that markets have tended to monopolies, and because the price of entry to markets is set so high, they end up with modal monopoly dominance. And so a civic economy based around local economies, based around widely distributed ownership, based around new models of association and new models of productivity is really the post-capitalist future.
Right. Capitalism. Well, I think capitalism is a great idea in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. At least it doesn't work in practice in relation to its own theory. And I think it's always interesting that whenever capitalism is discussed, it's discussed through extremely fetishistic categories. So, for example, all my students at the university where I work believe that we have just gone through a period of unprecedented neoliberalism. And everybody talks about neoliberalism as if it's a complete fait accompli. And what it, in a sense, confusing is that, in fact, the last 10, 20 years have seen deregulation in some areas of economic life, principally in the financial sector. But at the same time, we have to remember that in this so-called neoliberalist free market economy, we had quite high levels of state expenditure playing a role in the economy. In the case of Britain, around 40% even before the credit crunch. Even in the United States, which is meant to be the home of the free market, 35% of GDP was accounted for by state expenditure. But what we also had was the involvement of the state and of political decisions in the most important developments within capitalism itself. In many respects, the credit crunch, which we're all blaming on greedy bankers and financiers, was just as much a function of state-led policies of low interest rates and easy credit as it was of anybody else. And we have to remember that easy credit and low interest rates did not simply spontaneously emerge from the free market. They were, to a considerable extent, promoted through very clear political policies. I just want to make these points because you could regard the 1980s and the 1990s not just as deregulation, but as a period when the state assumed a very powerful regulatory impulse in a whole number of areas, particularly in terms of the regulation of industry, technology, scientific experimentation, and all the rest of that. So I do think we need to have a certain context within which these things actually occur. I spent most of my life, my adult life at least, being fairly critical of capitalism. But now I find myself in this very strange position that I need to rethink what's going on, not because I think I was wrong in the past, but because we live in a world where there's a very powerful trend of a small-minded criticism of capitalism, and the things that capitalism gets criticized for are its good bits. The fact that capitalism does expand wealth, does have an imperative towards developing the force of production, that capitalism has been able to create a globalized system where there's, to a considerable extent, greater prosperity. And what's very interesting is that precisely at a time when capitalism appears to have this potential, people begin to forget the fact that actually capitalism is a crisis-ridden system that's got its both destructive and its constructive sides. And I think it's interesting that at a time of expansion, people just lose sight of reality. I mean, when Gordon Brown says that he's going to abolish, the bust phase of the cycle, then obviously he's been reading the wrong books. And when you have a situation where the critics of capitalism, the anti-capitalist, anti-consumerist lobby, make the point that the problem with capitalism is that it always expands, and as long as we consume, it will expand even more. What they're doing is they're basically saying that capitalism is this contradictory free system that could carry on forever. The reality is, of course, and as we know, is that crises are imminent within the system of production, and it's something that we have to take on board and actually understand. It's interesting that capitalism has always had very few friends. If you look at the attempt to intellectually legitimate capitalism, there's very few people that come to mind. And I know whenever I talk to my kind of free market libertarian friends, they always take out a copy of Hayek or something. It's always the same 2 or 3 authors that get taken out. It's not like there's a huge library of intellectual support that has been built up. But what's also interesting is that whenever capitalism runs into trouble, people all of a sudden stop being very friendly to capitalism. And I remember reading Hayek, his book on the road to serfdom, making the point that everybody is a socialist all of a sudden. All these hardened entrepreneurs who were, into the free market in 1928, all of a sudden, convert to a kind of a Keynesian socialist strategy. And we see that today. I mean, I'm astounded. I've never seen a situation where people have flip-flopped so fast as in this credit crunch period. All of a sudden, we're buying our way out of the crisis. We're kind of buying our way out of the recession. Do you remember, it wasn't that long ago that every time the IMF rescued a nation, quite often against its will, the last thing that the point that it always made is you cannot buy yourself out of a crisis. We have to cut state expenditure, we have to do this, and we have to do that. Always the same old formula. All of a sudden, we've forgotten all that. And now we're going to buy ourselves through Keynesian policies, through spending a lot of money from this crisis. And of course, all that's really happening is just like in the 30s, people are finding it very difficult to basically stay loyal to a system that has delivered a fair amount of wealth for them over a period of time. Now, I think that in our circumstances, the most important thing that people can do is to actually alert ourselves to the fact that we live in a world where capitalism's destructive tendencies is not coming to the fore. We have to have a grown-up discussion about that, understand that the kind of problem we're facing isn't just another of those 120 crises that Paul Ormerod talked about. This isn't just simply a blip crisis that is going to, kind of turn out for the better. Often when I talk to people, they always say, Frank, when is the recession going to be over? It's almost like, waiting for the bus. When is the bus going to arrive? Sort of as if, this comes, on demand. The problem that we have to kind of deal with and engage with is that the nature of any recession, any social problem, and its resolution depends on our response to it. I think that's the important thing. The way we respond to it will determine, at least within a framework, how deep, how profound, and how destructive it will be. And I think that's an important point for us to realize. I think we have to take on board the fact that at the moment, none of the governments in the West are prepared to tell the public about the painful policies that will have to be passed in the in the short or medium term. We cannot sustain a regime where you buy yourself out of the crisis. You cannot have high levels of public expenditure in unproductive areas of life and just imagine that one day it's all going to come to a kind of a Keynesian nirvana. That isn't really going to happen. There's going to be some very difficult, some very hard choices to be made. I think we have to be prepared to discuss that, not because we want to somehow worship capitalism, because capitalism exists in a context. It kind of works sometimes really well, other times it doesn't work all that well. The reason why we need to do it is because unless we can discuss these kind of contradictory trends in a clear-sided way, our answers and our solutions to it will be fairly juvenile. And the big danger at the moment is by postponing that discussion, by not facing up to the fact that we've got these big problems. The crisis that we're facing at the moment is going to get far worse than if we had taken preemptive steps at an earlier stage. I just want to end up by saying that Keynes is not the solution. I think a lot of people here seem to imagine that good old Keynes is going to save us from our problems. I don't think Keynes did that in the 1930s as it happens anyway. I think there were other things that went on in the 1930s. I don't think that Keynesianism is the answer, and I'm very sad to see so many people all of a sudden developing their illusions about the capacity of the state to sort out the problems of the market. It doesn't really work that way, and we have to take a more realistic stand on this. I just want to end up by saying that a crisis, even a capitalist crisis, is not just simply an economic crisis, but is also a crisis of ideas. And it's really it raises questions about either have we got a better alternative to capitalism, which we should always be open to that possibility. If we haven't got a better alternative to capitalism, then what do we do within these circumstances to make sure that its destructive impact is contained as much as possible and its destructive effects upon people is going to be limited? Thank you.
Okay, thanks to everyone for that. I think we can maybe get on to questions about alternatives in the audience discussion if people want to do that. But I think this has been a useful reminder from all the contributions that capitalism is not just capitalism, that there are different ways of understanding it. And so before we come on to the audience, I just want to ask a couple of questions to unpack a bit what is it that we're actually talking about, and bring together some of the things that the speakers have said. If I can ask, first of all, Paul and Sanjaya, the same question. I mean, Paul, you made the point that capitalism is not purely a market system. And as Frank was suggesting, there's always been a deal of state intervention. And I suppose the question is, when does state intervention start to undermine the workings of capitalism itself? Because Sanjaya, you made the point about entrepreneurial capitalism being the model that you favour, which is often argued in the case of India. But then what you call China's command capitalism is arguably seems to be more successful than India's entrepreneurial capitalism, particularly when it comes not to individual capitalist enterprises but to infrastructure. You know, the Chinese command capitalism has meant that they've done all kinds of public works, roads, dams, airports, and the kind of infrastructure that's missing from parts of India. So do you think that there's more of a role for the state there? But Paul, do you want to come in first on the state?
Well, when does the state overwhelm capitalism? Well, it did in Russia in 1917, and look what a complete disaster that was for the people of Russia. I mean, their living standards were appalling for decades as a result of that. So beyond a certain point, yes, but I mean, the state can take, I mean, the history of capitalism shows that the state can take varying, very widely varying amounts of roles in the economy. Sometimes as low as 5 or 6% at the present time. Its claims on resources are around 25% in terms of people employed. So at these levels, I mean, different forms of capitalism all work. There are different levels. I mean, Swedish capitalism is different from American capitalism, is different from French capitalism, is different from British capitalism. But over the long run, they all deliver very, very similar systems. Now, if I could just make a comment on China. I mean, it seems to me there's nothing particularly miraculous about what's going on in China. It's very well described in Marx about the primitive phase of capital accumulation. That's what happens in all societies which embark on the path to becoming successful developed economies. There's a lot of dynamism, rapid expansion rates, and we see, as we see in China today, dramatic widenings of inequality. China's a much more unequal society than any Western society, and that's an inevitable part of becoming a successful, developed economy. So those were just my brief comments on that.
Sanjay?
Right. I think, you know, in the Cold War period, the race between 1917 and 1989 between the West and the Soviet Union, there were two different models of political organization and economic organization, and therefore the Cold War was seen as a battle between capitalism and socialism, or state socialism, as the Russians called it. But what we are seeing in the last 2 decades in China is an imitation on many levels of Western capitalism, except that instead of individual enterprise, you have state-directed enterprise. Individual enterprise is now beginning to emerge even in China. And if the Chinese model succeeds in the long run, there would be an argument in favor of what you could call illiberal capitalism, or command capitalism is the phrase I use, because you have a form of capitalism which is delivering growth, but at the expense of individual liberty. And whether you choose that form or the form that we have in India, in which you have a democracy and individual liberty, is a political decision. It is not based on economics alone. You want political democracy, you want individual freedom, you want freedom of enterprise for individuals. It comes with a price. You want to deny that, but you want a controlled command capitalist system. That too comes with a price. What price are you willing to pay? I think the decision we have made in India is that we are willing to pay an economic price, but hold on to the democracy that we have. The choice that China seems to have made is to hold on to economic prosperity at the cost of individual democracy or individual freedom.
Okay, thanks. Frank and Philip can respond to those if you like. I wanted to ask in particular about, Frank, you made the point about the response to the crisis being the important thing, and obviously there are alternatives in terms of what states and people do in response to this. And Philip set out his own alternative. And I'm wondering whether, you talked about anti-capitalism, and I wonder, what do we understand by anti-capitalism? Again, when is it that it actually challenges the essence of the system? Because Philip's point about Catholic capitalism does seem obviously conservative, I mean, avowedly conservative. Rather than overthrowing the system, it seems to be about restraint and self-sacrifice, perhaps, to some extent. And is that part of the painful policies that Frank was suggesting, or is it an alternative to the painful policies? I mean, maybe you could answer that, and then Frank.
I think that, look, let's start from something very obvious. You walk down any British high street, and what do you see? You see clone towns. Everything's the same corporate modes dominate. You only get small enterprises on the feeder roads into your city centre. Essentially what's happened just in retail is because we have gone for monopoly capitalism, the supermarkets, through the economies of scale, have destroyed the base for small and medium enterprises. They force monopolies on farmers because farmers can only compete if they can equal those economies of scales. So monopoly generates monopoly. Whereas if you go to northern Italy, walk around Milan, and you see nothing but owner-occupiers. You see people who still can generate a decent living from their society. Also, you see in Milan that, in northern Italy, they've got a Catholic foundation called the Foundation for Subsidiarity and Compagnie dell'Opera. And what they do is they're small groups of companies that operate together and buy and sell services from one another so that they can prevent themselves from being picked off by monopoly concerns. The outcome of this is you have a society that's much more stable because no one can be proletarianized, because everybody owns and everybody can sell and trade with one another. What happens in our societies, in the so-called advanced societies, is, as Frank said, and I agree with that part of his analysis, is that both state and market have essentially been in a covert alliance to disempower everybody, to turn people into nothing but waged workers who consume through credit. That's the so-called advanced societies that we've generated. Doesn't deliver security, doesn't deliver human relationships, doesn't create the conditions for families to flourish. We have to work all the hours God sends, and we still can't make bills, pay the bills. So I mean, that's in the vernacular. And I think that what we're about to happen now in terms of the global economy is essentially widespread deflationary crisis. We've got Bank of England that's full of second-rate economists who in their recent inflation report didn't even include the consumption deflator that they said, oh, well, commodities are rising, inflation's coming up, consumers, there must be inflation. And what's actually going to happen very, very shortly is we're going to enter a full deflationary crisis where permanent asset falls means nobody will buy anything. We're already going to have commodity deflation next year. So it's going to be a completely different paradigm. And the answer has to be from both left and right. More people have to own and more people have to trade. Whereas the current settlement means less and less people trade and less people own.
Okay, thanks. I suppose we're talking about cultures of capitalism. I mean, Frank, do you think that there's scope for alternatives in that respect?
Well, I think there's always a fairly powerful romantic impulse within capitalism to recapture a particular life that is more wholesome and more total. And I can very much understand that because we all like to go to Italy and Spain and sample slow food and sample life in that kind of organic, total way. The only problem is that if you talk to Spanish and Italian people, they, on balance, would rather come and live in England or in America than stay in their village. I mean, if you look at migration patterns, you will find that there are rich British, sort of middle-class people buying houses in Italy, not to work there, but to live off the resources that they've accumulated in this country. But you have a lot of Italians and Spanish people going all over the world looking for employment for the very simple reason that romantic, conservative, or Catholic capitalism can employ even less people than capitalism on a bad day, you know, sort of. And that's the way that it works. Now, I agree with you that, you know, people are dispossessed in our kind of society, and that's one of the destructive byproducts of the way that we live in. But the alternative to that is not to create a kind of a romantic economy where people kind of, you know, basically create a rural poorhouse where everybody's given something, but not very much, or to alternatively. This
is why the left is in inherent alliance with monopoly capitalism.
I know, yeah. I know that.
You love it.
I do, and I've got a membership card by my alliance, you know, sort of. I'm in alliance with all kinds of people, you know, sort of. But that's the reality, and it's something that history has shown us that by and large, you know, human beings have got a desire to progress. They have whenever they have the incentive, they move into new circumstances. They grab opportunities, and you know, we have the luxury here in England to say, oh, aren't they cute, these people still living on the land and still having an organic life? But by and large, we do that from a privileged position, where we can either be like them in our fantasies, or alternatively to kind of do our jobs. And it seems to me there's a very big danger here, because, you know, quite often I talk to my students, and they go to India and they say, oh, look at Indian people. They're so non-materialistic. All they do is eat their rice and, you know, sort of are not interested in money and everything else. And, you know, shouldn't we be like them as well? And all that it is just a Western, you know, exotic romanticism where you understandably would like a more total experience. But can I just say something very, very small about the state? You see, the problem with the state is this. If you take a country like Britain, right, we already got rid of most of our industries in the 1980s. And we really kind of try to find solutions to our problems by moving into the service sector. The financial sector is a very important part of the British economy, right? At the moment, the only sector of the economy that's likely to sort of provide jobs or to have any degree of economic momentum is the public sector, because everything seems to be loaded on it. Now, if we load even more on the public sector at this particular stage in time, I think we're going to have huge problems. And that's really the point I was trying to make earlier on about the way in which the state at the moment in many European societies is not going to become the engine of growth in the way that we hope it would be. And therefore, we need to look somewhere else. Is there any other way in which we can manage and deal with some of these issues?
Okay, very quick from Paul.
Well, yes, I think both Frank and Philip are much more confident about their forecast than I am, because I used to be an economic forecaster. I know it doesn't work, you know. So it's not possible to say with any degree of confidence what's going to happen over the next 2 or 3 years. But what we do know is that capitalist economies have a great resilience. They have a tremendous ability to recover across a whole range of different policy regimes from absolutely dramatic shocks. So, for example, here's a big shock that happened in Japan. You know, it's in 1945. Its cities were firebombed and it had atomic bombs dropped on it. Yet by 1951, it had restored its pre-war living standards. Germany was overrun by the Red Army. Its cities were laid waste by American and British bombers. But again, by 1951, it had restored its pre-war living standards. In France, Britain and Germany, at the end of the First World War, under a completely different policy regime, completely different, output fell between 20 and 25%. Catastrophic falls in output. Yet by the mid-late 20s, the economies had restored themselves again and again exceeded pre-war levels. So capitalist economies, across a whole variety of roles of the state, a whole variety of different policy regimes, have a tremendous resilience to actually recover from absolutely dramatic and fundamental shocks, much bigger than the one we're seeing now. You know, if you've got a financial crisis, it's not the same as having an atomic bomb dropped on you.
Okay, I'm going to ask everyone to come back on this a bit later, but on the optimistic note, I want to come to the audience because I know that you will want to speak. Can I see the microphones? Okay. I'll take a group of questions and then come back to the panel. Do feel free to make comments as well as asking questions, but try to keep them as concise as possible because I don't want to get people in. Okay, at the side there. Oh, sorry. At the back, right. Straight in front of you, yeah.
Phil Mullen. Paul, I concur with your point that throughout 200 years, capitalism has been a very resilient system, as we've heard. It's prone to crises every so often, and through a destructive process of reorganization, generally gets out of them. But there's a big difference with the post-war years, the post-war reconstruction, a difference even with the interwar years, which is that the whole discussion about the economy, or about political economy, has been depoliticized over the course of the last 25 years. And that sort of informs what has been a very sort of managerial and technical approach, both in terms of activities, but also in terms of the discussion since the 1980s. We've moved into a situation where now economics, in contrast to those earlier periods you mentioned, where there was a certain dynamic to actually look through what was the drivers for capitalism, what were the drivers of capitalism problems, and to actually force a restructuring to allow capitalism to go on. That's been absent because of this depoliticization over the last period. And the recent example of it over the last 14 months has been this very procrastinating, dithering, indecisive responses, technical responses to the crisis. So I think what this credit crunch poses for us, I would suggest, is much less of an economic or a financial challenge for us, but it's much more of an intellectual challenge to begin to repoliticize an understanding of what is going on at the economic level in order for both dealing with the immediacy, the short-term fixes, but more profoundly understanding what it is at the level of the economic atrophy of the system which has prompted and produced the crisis we're going through now. A repoliticization is what's the demand, I would say.
Okay, thanks. There's a guy with long hair a bit further forward.
Cheers. Yeah, I think coming back to the sort of the name of the debate, capitalism, what it's good for. To a certain extent, I think everyone can pretty much be in agreement that we know the positive aspects of capitalism. We know the growth dynamic and the ability to revolutionise means of production and constant technological advance, and that's all good. But I would like to come back on what I thought was a bit of a linear sort of analysis of the economy by the first speaker, sorry I forgot the name, where we were introduced to simply sort of reams of benefits which have been attributed to the capitalist system over the years. And basically, I'd just like to point out that although we know that the capitalist system does have benefits, what it's easy to miss out with a question stated such as this are, well, the negatives as well. And it's interesting to point out that capitalism is a system which is riven with internal economic contradictions. And taking the examples of the increases in wealth and prosperity in many Western countries, such as the welfare system, etc., is a good example of that. It's interesting to see...
Quickly.
Sorry. Okay. It's very interesting to see, basically, that although the capitalist system does have an innate interest in freeing up economic markets and economic liberalism, at the same time has an interest in shoring up. These are two different economic interests. I can't finish my point very quickly, so I'll pass.
All right, thanks. At the side of the aisle here, behind you.
Furedi is surprised that people have suddenly become Keynesians, but I think that if you read more widely, amongst the monetarists in the 80s even, the free market economists, they all recognised and in fact argued for state spending as a response to events like those that we've just seen, and said that the problem during the Depression was precisely that the state didn't spend more, didn't print more money, do all of those things. And it seems like the only thing that we've been told is that we need to have an adult discussion about this, that he knew about the crunch a long time ago but didn't tell anyone, but hasn't actually explained why he disagrees with the broad economic consensus that that is the kind of practical action that we need to stave off something much worse. So I think I'd like a little bit more flesh on the bones as to why he stands so far from the consensus.
Okay, thanks. There's a woman on the side here. Could you pass that down? Thanks.
Hi, I'm just a general member of the public. I'm no way involved in economics or the banking system or anything like that. I know we're going through a difficult financial patch, but I also know that the media tend to hype things up a little bit. So what I've been wondering since all of this credit crunch crisis has entered the newspapers is if we are actually going through something as massive as being reported, or if it is just more hyped up, then is actually the problem. Okay. Just my question.
Good question. There's a guy just in front of you. Could you? Yeah.
I just wanted to bring something to the notice of the House. I come from India, and what we need to note is that India is the only country in the history of the world that is capitalizing under a democracy. And there is a massive political backlash against the disposition and inequality that capitalism inevitably ensues. So the Manmohan Singh government, the Congress party, for example, has lost almost all assembly elections that it has fought since the government came to power. Since 1991, when India embraced the liberalization policy, governments have changed every 5 years, and there is no one big political party that can hold the attention of the entire nation. So political parties are getting very smaller too. And it is possible that the capitalist project of capitalizing and monopolizing the entire economy would not be successful in India because the political backlash is so strong. And there I see an opportunity of creating a different kind of economy that you were talking about, and maybe creating a different kind of person. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. There's a guy in the black jacket at the back, behind you. Yeah. And then the guy behind him, and then we're going to come back.
Thank you for your speeches. My question is very specific one regarding the policy making and the regulations of financial industries, especially within the UK. I mean, in the light of the credit crunch, and we have actually seen in the recent couple of months that the government actually has taken over a large proportion of the banks, and we have actually seen the government becoming a major player in the financial activities and the economy and the banking sector in the UK. And basically, at the same time, government is also the rule setter and basically regulating the whole industry. So what's your point of view in this respect? Is this something of a trend which we're going to see in the long run? Is that a more sustainable model where the government plays a bigger role as a player as well as a rule setter? And basically, is it the optimal solution? And is there anything better, or is it permanent, or are we gonna see the whole things changing as soon as we get out of the credit crunch, what we are experiencing at the moment? Thank you.
Thanks. Could you give the mic to the guy behind?
I'm just interested in some of the questions of how societies, as they're kind of currently constituted, particularly in Western Europe, particularly in Britain, will respond to a recession. I mean, one of the aspects of political and cultural life that seems to me to have changed over the last 20 years is the very, very marked problem that the state and the political class have in mobilising people. And in a recession, when you have to take some of these hard choices, particularly if it's cutting back state expenditure or restructuring parts of the economy, it's quite important to be able to mobilise people on your side so you can push through what you want to do. So I'm quite interested to hear from the panel whether the very manifest estrangement of the political class from society means that the state particularly is equipped to do this. And I'd also like to know whether aspects of politics today seem to support the destructive elements of capitalism. So if state spending is going to be investment in, say, wind turbines and environmental policy, could that actually enhance some of the destructive aspects of the economy?
Okay, thanks. I'm going to come back to the panel now for brief responses. Don't try to respond to everything, because obviously you can't. Does anyone want to come back on anything in particular? Paul?
Yeah, I mean, people always every time it happens, people are always surprised when a recession happens, but it's not happening on anything like the scale of the 1930s, at least yet. I mean, in America, 1 in 4 people were unemployed. I mean, it really was an absolutely catastrophic fall in output, much more, far, far more than we've seen now. But I think there's a lot of general questions about what should be done. Surely Miss Keynes saying this, whatever. And in my view, the role of intellect in successful policy formation is grossly over-exaggerated. What actually happens is that people try things, they experiment with things, and they find out what works, and quite often they get it wrong. Now, here's an example. The Americans let Lehman's go to the wall. They let Lehman Brothers collapse. They thought this might actually be a salutary lesson. It turned out that when people saw the consequences of that, they said, Christ, we can't allow that anymore, it'll be a complete disaster. And I think they were right. But actually by doing that, I think if they hadn't let Lehman's go to the wall, the government would still be dithering and saying, oh, what are we going to do? What we should be doing, what should we be doing? And it was a good example. It wasn't through any intellectual thing. I mean, just one final point. My own personal view, I mean, Keynes and Hayek's been mentioned. My own personal view, in fact, I've written a paper on this, it's on my website, is that Keynes and Hayek had much, much more in common in terms of analysing capitalism than people realise. Both of them saw capitalism as fundamentally a disequilibrium system. They knew most of the time it wasn't in equilibrium. There were crises, there were booms, and that is an inherent part of what capitalism is. And both Keynes and Hayek completely understood that, and it's textbook economics which doesn't.
Okay, thanks. Sanjaya?
Yes, well, a couple of things. One, as a former editor, I think media tends to, exaggerate the bad news always. So, basic law in journalism is that you never report a dog biting a man, but man biting a dog is always front page news, right? So that's kind of ABCs of journalism. So as a former editor, I would say that I think the media in general, and certainly I see even British media, kind of exaggerates the negative stories always. So I'm not surprised that you think there's a hype. On the specific comment about India, let me get back on that and say that, look, I think it's one of the great strengths of a democracy that governments come and governments go. I mean, political parties being voted out is a positive thing. That shows that society is in flux. People are unhappy with something, they vote people out. I think it's a great sign of a robust democracy. So I wouldn't really hold that as a negative comment on policy. On the other hand, what we have to ask is there a reversal of policy with a change of government? I mean, just like in Britain, Margaret Thatcher undid everything that the Labour believed in, but did Labour reverse whatever she did? Will Conservatives reverse whatever the Labour did here? But there will be a change of government. Same thing in India. Since 1991, the reforms that were introduced, there have been 6 different political parties in power, or 6 different governments in office with the various combinations of coalitions. Not one policy has been reversed. There's a movement forward in terms of policy change. So I don't think one should get mixed up between political parties losing in elections and the general public perception about policy. I think the real strength of the Indian experiment is that we are trying to build a modern entrepreneurship-based capitalist economy within the framework of a democracy. It's never been done before. I think that statement is absolutely right. It's never been done anywhere else in the world, that you have a country transiting from a backward agrarian society into a modern industrial nation within the framework of a democracy. Not one example.
One of the things that you will find is that politicians from the Bush regime to the Brown regime are all extremely worried about what the consequences of this recession can have on the electorate. And they're all making short-term calculations of how to basically prevent the public from sort of understanding the kind of potential pain that they might have to experience as a result of what has happened. If you don't believe me, all you have to do is just try to recall what happened in Congress the very first time they tried to kind of bring that rescue package and implement it, and it didn't happen. But if you looked at the faces of those congressmen and senators, they were all in a state of panic. I mean, they basically had no idea what to do or what can happen. And you could just sense a real sense of political disorientation that exists. And I think that's the case today. I think the political classes are not letting on, telling to the public the very simple fact that you cannot maintain existing levels of transfer payments. You cannot maintain existing levels of welfare. You cannot just simply kind of carry on in the way that has been the case in the past, that all of their public expenditure plans that were kind of budgeted for a while back are, in a sense, unrealistic. And if you do go ahead with them, they're going to have sort of profound dislocating and negative kind of consequences. So I do think that we have to realize at the moment we're not facing up to what's going on. Now, I've written a lot about fear and the media's hype of fear, and I think it's a very normal experience. I think in relation to global warming, in relation to child obesity, in relation to the avian flu and SARS and all these things, you can see how the media creates an apocalyptic scenario of danger. I think what I find in relation to a very real socioeconomic crisis, a lack of vocabulary with which to deal with. And I would say that if anything, the media adopts a very naturalistic, fatalistic approach towards that. Instead of saying what the problems are, the question they're always asking people is, when is it going to be over? And that seems to be, every time you listen to the Today program, they will say, oh, when do you think this recession is going to be over? As if somehow by asking that question, we don't have to talk about what's going to happen between now and the time it's over. Because that's what the real difficulty is. Now, just in relation to Paul's point about about forecasting, I haven't got a track record in forecasting. That's not my expertise. But I don't think you need a PhD in economics to see that there are some very profound destabilizing trends at play. And they're not the end of the world. That's happened before. No doubt we'll solve them again. But these destabilizing tendencies are going to have some very real consequences for people's jobs, for the levels of state expenditure. They're going to intensify international conflict and put to question the levels of global cooperation that we have at the moment. And these are very real dangers that we have to face up to. We live in a world which is very different than in the past because of these things. And instead of, you don't have to make a drama out of them. You don't have to say it's the end of the world, but it is a very real problem that we need to somehow kind of engage with it in a more realistic way than we're doing at the moment, instead of pretending it's just a little recession.
Thanks. I reiterate my point that what we lack is a mechanism to distribute the benefits of growth. The state as a redistributive mechanism has failed. The market as a redistribution mechanism has failed. All this talk about capitalism, it's great. I don't have enough capital. I don't know about you. Savings rates are at levels of the late 1940s in Britain. Mass share ownership has completely collapsed. People own very little, and what they do own is hugely leveraged, is hugely indebted. The other capital excess they have isn't put into any form of productive investment. It's put into consumption, conspicuous or otherwise. The real story is the huge level of indebtedness that we're in. When Labour came to power, personal debt was 570 billion. Now it's 1.5 trillion. Total private sector debt in 10 years since 1997 is now 227% of GDP. That includes personal debt and corporate debt. We've seen, just in private debt alone, a 165% increase. Now, this is all potentially disastrous. Why? Because the bailout that we've done, all the money that we've flooded in, that we've now crowded gone from 40% public sector debt to 50% of GDP, all of that money is reliant on asset prices. It's all reliant on house prices. If house prices drop by another 10%, all of the state-sponsored cash is then at risk by a multiplier factor. Because remember, all of those assets we bought are themselves leveraged of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. So the level of debt that we might need just from a 10% decrease in the base asset on what all debt is secured could be 100 times what we've already come up with. We don't have that, and we can't deliver that. Therefore, what we need is radical anti-foreclosure policies so that we prevent any capturing of assets and any selling off of assets, distressed assets. We also need rises in real wages, because the way you deal with a bubble is that a debt bubble, and it's across commodities, housing, equities, hedge funds, is you create the conditions for debtors to repay. Now, the only way we can create the conditions for debtors to repay is, as I've said, rise real wages or real incomes. But you can't do that on the present model. What we must do, therefore, contrary to what Frank said about romantic Catholicism, which comes from not knowing these nations, Germany has followed a Catholic paleo-corporatist model, and it's still the world's largest exporter, precisely because it set up an essentially Christian-influenced and conservative-influenced idea of a compact between capital and labour, that labour accepted high levels of investment in return for further down the line higher levels of wages. That's the model we're going to need for the future. We're going to need to create local economies. £1 spent in a local economy generates £2 for that local economy. £1 spent in a corporate venture generates 50p, and they offshore it and don't pay tax on it anyway. Okay. So, in essence, I think the future is civic, it's ownership, and it's participative. And it's anti-state and anti-market.
Okay, there's some disagreement here on the panel, but I'm going to come back out to the audience. Right in the middle. And then, Kevin, can you come to the front?
A question for Frank, really, where you said we need to discuss alternative to capitalism, and if we don't have one, then we need to look at how to contain the most destructive effects of the market on people's lives. I'm just curious, because an economic slump, as I understand it, and the accelerated restructuring that involves, is both the expression and the temporary and partial solution to the economic crisis. In other words, the fact that you have a slump and the way in which the weaker capitalists go to the wall is part of the restructuring that's required for the system to carry on. If that's the case, how can you possibly say that we want to contain the effects of the restructuring if that's the partial solution to carrying on?
Okay. Yeah.
There has been in these meetings very little reference to any type of genuine alternative to the system that exists, capitalism. This, I would say, is primarily because of the mythology that what existed in the Soviet Union in the Eastern Bloc was in some peculiar way to do with socialism. In reality, and one of the members of the panel mentioned this earlier on, what really existed in the Soviet Union was state capitalism. In other words, capitalism did exist in Eastern Europe and Russia before 1991. It was just that it was in a different form from the one that exists in the West. Now, the thing is that in the 1970s, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization showed that that if the agricultural resources of the world were used in a rational, humane way, then 7 times the existing global population at that time, which was 4 billion, could be fed. Of course, the caveat of that was that it should be used in a humane way. But of course, capitalism doesn't operate that way, because the bottom line of capitalism is always profit and competition. Competition involves an enormous amount of waste. Enterprises compete with one another. The ones that fail go under. You have loads of people who are unemployed, just as you've got starving peasants and people living in poverty in third world countries. What we need is a system of production for human need and not profit. That is the answer to the recessions and...
Okay, thanks for that. Over here, and then there's a guy at the side over there.
I'm slightly confused because today I've heard that capitalism is not really about markets, but it's about entrepreneurship. And I used to think that entrepreneurship was about people. It just so happens that until this day, that's been pushed to the fore the most by the capitalist system. But actually, entrepreneurship, creativity, ambition, aspiration, they're human and even more so political qualities. And I think what we need to realize today is actually that we need to develop these qualities further and beyond capital, and that these qualities are our own. They don't belong to some kind of abstract system. They're our own. And we need to push them more than we have so far, not less. Not go back to the cave ages, but go to somewhere better, somewhere further, somewhere new.
Okay. Over the side here. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, finally, we've actually got a bit of a battle of ideas. People are suggesting alternatives. Instead of the sort of Fukuyamian end of history, there is no alternative to capitalism that we've seen from the majority of the panel. To answer the lady's question who has said, why are they reporting this crisis? Crisis makes it easy to pass extreme measures. What we got with the Hank Paulson, ex-head of Goldman Sachs' first bailout plan was the financial equivalent of the Patriot Act, taking away freedom from people, authorizing the biggest redistribution of wealth since the New Deal, but it was going the wrong way. Frank Furedi mentioned that we don't have neoliberalism. I agree with him. What we have is neo-cronyism, neo-corporatism. What we've seen is a takeover, state capture by corporate interests. It's time we fight that. At this end of the panel, we heard China is choosing capitalism now, democracy later. Let's ask ourselves, are we doing anything different? What we should actually want is a bit of democracy now.
Okay, thanks. Kevin, yourself, and then we'll have someone.
In answering the question, capitalism, what does it stand for? Paul on the panel eloquently outlined some of the improvements in material life standards instituted by capitalism. Thus, I would like to ask a much deep-rooted question, which is, what does the panel think of the desirability of such a materialistic conception of progress? And also, more interestingly, I would like to find out what Frank thinks, or what your answer is to the question of capitalism. What is it good for?
Okay, thanks. There's a guy in a white T-shirt here, and then the guy at the back. Okay.
Capitalism gave us a coal industry, or Western capitalism did, but it doesn't want India to have one, or China to burn coal. It gave us an oil industry and transport and cars, but Rajendra Pakhari, who I'm sorry to say is the Indian chief of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said that the Ratan Tata Nano gave him nightmares. That was a deeply scientific statement. Capitalism also gave us research and development. Willis Whitney founded the first industrial research organization independent of GE's commercial objectives, and yet GE financed it. And yet in all of these things, they don't want to pursue R&D today. I think there's been far too much talk about the dynamism and growth of capitalism. You and I know it isn't fast enough, and that all the innovations in the United States, bar Google and Apple, have happened on Wall Street. So I also think there's no innovation in economic thought. The fact that we're going back to Keynes, I wondered if the panelists would like to comment on the preface to the German edition of the General Theory in 1936, where Keynes said, in 1936 to Germans, that Keynesian theory was better and more easily applied in totalitarian states than in liberal democracies. And if you look at the Obama program on energy security, it ain't totalitarian, but it does want every US citizen to engage in a new partnership with the state around energy efficiency in home and car. All you understand to be independent of the Saudis. So we're going to see a lot more Keynesianism, and as Frank Furedi said, it's going to come right down to your personal life, how and how much you run a car, and whether you turn that thermostat up or down.
Okay, I'm not going to get everyone in, and I have to come back to the panel soon, but you at the front, and then just behind, in the bald head glasses. Further back. Behind you. Sorry, wrong one. Yeah.
Just kind of a question to the panel, as well as just kind of a point to make, is part of the problem that we're looking at possibly that, we're looking at state-based solutions here. I mean, one of the very important points that both Marx and Hayek and other kind of free marketeers like Murray Rothbard have pointed out is that the problem may in fact be that the corporatist structure and the state capitalism that's occurred under under communist regimes is that in fact, no matter what you do, someone wants to expropriate from the rest of the population, whether it be through a politician or through some sort of, corporatist, big government type of, capitalist. And is the problem not that we're discouraging entrepreneurship on the, on the micro level because we have such influential government over, this, what we call capitalism now, which is certainly not a free market system at all.
Okay, the other bald gentleman at the front, please, after you, and then you, and then I'm going to have to finish it with Fred.
No? Can you hear me now? So mention was made of repoliticization, and what the main problem is who's going to engage in this process, because, the alternative, I would consider would be some form of communism or socialism, but how do you re-engage the politics of that? It seems that all discussion seems to be in the basis that the system of communism is beyond the pale, and you can't go back to that. So how do you engage the majority of the people to re-engage with that idea again?
Okay, thanks.
Well, I've got an answer for that, because I would like to see a communist or socialist society. Those two words
of me mean exactly the same thing. But let's have a look at capitalism from the practical point of view of us working people, those amongst us, which is the majority, who have to sell our lives, our abilities, our creativity to an employer, somebody who's going to use us to make a profit. Now, capitalism is a system based on profit, and therefore it's a commercial system which throws up consequences. In a commercial system like ours, and it's out there, you need banking, insurance, taxation, advertising, money lending, debt collecting, the law, police, prisons, armies, navies, air forces, military industrial complexes, salespeople of every different kind, weights and measures, trading standards, customs and excise, the gambling industry, stock exchanges. Now, all this work, all this social endeavour that is absolutely essential to capitalism absorbs around 80% of all social effort and produces absolutely no wealth whatsoever. No food, clothing, shelter, medicine, education, art, music, dance, sport, literature, transportation, all the things we need for a fulfilled and fulfilling life. Now, get rid of the commercial system, and instead of producing for profit, we produce to satisfy human needs. We would then have, instead of just 20% of us available to roll our sleeves up and get stuck in to volunteer to produce the goods and services that we need, there will be 100% of us available. So life will be a lot easier and a lot more fulfilling. In capitalism, with this 80% of us doing unnecessary work, it's 4 times more expensive to sell something than it is to make, and we are so busy taking care of business, we don't have time to take care of ourselves. And they've not mentioned the wars we have in capitalism. And all wars are commercial wars.
Okay,
based on raw materials, trade routes, markets, and spheres of influence. They ignore all this. What they're doing here is the reformists tinkering with capitalism to try and make it work. To make capitalism work for ordinary working people like ourselves is like trying to get a slaughterhouse to run in the interest of the animals it processes. It can't be done.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, just the third row here. Okay, socialism is not dead, it seems, but we can continue to debate that at the reception, perhaps.
Hi there. I'd just like to throw a quote to the floor, which is by a Republican congressman called Ron Paul. And he says, "You cannot criticize free market capitalism until you actually have it." If we actually look to the US, we have a multi-trillion-dollar welfare dependency. We have a central bank which has a complete monopoly on interest rates, and inflation for that matter, because it just prints money out of free air. We have Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, who were in large, responsible for the subprime meltdown, who were making government incentivize subprime mortgages. So I contend that the alternative to the capitalism we have today is the true free market capitalism that was promoted by the Austrian School of Economics. And you said, who are the heroes of capitalism? There are no fans of capitalism. Well, Friedman, Rothbard, Nozick, these were the true heroes of 19th and 20th century political philosophy and economics. So I say the solution to capitalism we have today is capitalism.
Okay, thanks. The left's not dead, the right's not dead. We're going to come back to the panel, though, for them to discuss what that means for us and in terms of the discussion we've been having. Obviously, it's the beginning of a discussion, and we're not resolving anything here. I'm going to give everyone just 2 minutes, if you can try and keep it to that, to sum up today. So, Frank.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of demagogy here. It sounds very nice, production for need, not for profit. But you see, in the real world, what happens is that people get up in the morning, they brush their teeth. They don't say, am I going to produce today for profit or for need? Right? That's not how the way it works in the real world is that when people have an incentive to produce, when they have a genuine incentive to make things happen, then they all of a sudden discover a potential and a capacity to do great things. They innovate, they work hard, they discover all kinds of talents and gifts they never imagined they had before, as long as they have an incentive to do that. Now, one of the things that we've learned, over the last 100 years is that societies, other than capitalist societies, have not been able to create a system of incentive for people to produce either for need or for profit. If people haven't got the incentive to produce or to innovate, not very much is going to happen. And that's the bottom line. It's got nothing to do with capitalism. It's nothing to do with any kind of social system. It's a basic fact of life that people, you and I, are not going to do things simply because it's needed. We're going to do things because we have an incentive to do it. That's how we work. In our own families, with our children, we do all kinds of wonderful things because our children need them. But as far as anything else is concerned, we're not going to be naturally, in a religious sense, altruistic and do very nice things for other people. Otherwise, sort of all the attempts at cooperation, all the attempts at collectives, all the attempts at building planned economies would have been a little bit more effective in terms of working. And that's the reality of it. And the problem that we have today is that the only alternatives to capitalism that we have are not future-oriented. There are no future-oriented movements attacking capitalism. The only movements against capitalism are backward-looking ones. They're like, sort of the ones that were mentioned here, and there are even worse types, which basically, go back to the land, don't consume, so consumption is bad. We mustn't, sort of walk around in flashy clothes. We mustn't let Indians have, sort of cars. We mustn't let the Chinese have refrigerators. They are basically low expectations critiques of capitalism. And that's, to me, is far worse than anything that capitalism does. And I think that's the point of departure for any kind of discussion. Now, somebody said to me, asked me this question, well, how can you contain the destructive effects of the recession or the crisis? Well, the way you contain it is by not doing what happened in Japan, where, as you will recall, there was a very long recession recently, where year and year and year out, the government was not prepared to face up to the fact that they got a mega problem and just hope by tinkering here and there, things will happen. But of course, the Japanese economy just went into this kind of slow, stagnating kind of period. Japan, until then, was the most dynamic, one of the most dynamic economies in the world. We don't want to do that in Europe. We don't want to somehow not confront the problems that exist. It's far better to kind of face up to the pain in the here and now, in the short term, and not to drag it out, than to simply allow political calculations to distract from the fact that a lot of difficult decisions will have to be taken. So I think that seems to me the way you minimize the pain, by getting over the illness as fast as possible in order to bring some kind of cure about.
Okay, thanks. Marx is the most right-wing thinker I've ever read. And this is exemplified by Frank. I mean,
obviously you don't read very much.
Yes. I suspect and suggest the reverse. It's very clear that we see the alliance between left and right, embodied here and embodied in the floor. It's the only thing wrong for people like Frank with capitalism is you're all in favour of it, you love productive forces, let's have more. The only problem is it's not distributed in the right way. Now, the mechanisms for distribution, democracy, we don't know it, goodness, we have to think hard about it, incredibly intellectually convincing. There are clear limits on production. It's called the environmental crisis, and there is one. We might not like it, but it's there. A society that's purely focused on consumption is inherently in league with capitalism. The left again. They're inherently in league with a certain type of consumption that fundamentally alters, changes, and destabilizes what it is to be human. The real issue is, and it's in Polanyi, I don't know if you've read Polanyi's Great Transformation, but Polanyi. The point is, in that text, it was very clear that what has happened is markets have broken out of social control. And they've broken out of social control, and they've broken out of being embedded in societies that they serve. They've broken out of being related to the goods that human beings want: stability, security, maintenance of human relations. All our modes of economic exchange, including the perpetual demand to consume more, to work more, to deliver more, are linked into the destabilizing of a human society. The future is Catholic, in the sense there's never been more Christians on the planet. Religion, this provincial secularism you have is charming and interesting, but it's regional and provincial. Now, when I say Catholic, I'm only saying that it's this type of thinking that is actually delivering the civic society that people want, the structures of ownership that people want, the idea that they have some levels of security, some levels of relationship. It's produced the great economies of the world. It's produced Germany. We need a corporatism, not of state and market, but of people and capital, so that people own for producing for people.
Okay, thanks. Sanjaya, do you want to come next?
No, I think it was Winston Churchill who once is quoted as having said that the best political system for the common man is democracy, and the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the common man. And I think it's this whole debate on capitalism is also something like that. I mean, there is no other economic system that has actually unleashed human productivity in the way in which capitalism has. And that is precisely why it has survived despite all its problems. And yet, it is precisely for this reason that it has also created so many problems for itself. And you got it, as I said at the very beginning, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there is something called a crisis. There is the downside of the system, but capitalism has shown a remarkable ability to revive itself, reform itself, and go on. And it will continue to go on till there is another system that has a similar ability to reinvent itself. All other systems at the moment of their crisis have collapsed. This one has not yet. When it does, if something else comes up, the world will change.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Paul.
Okay, Frank mentioned Japan. It's been mentioned a few times. Japan hasn't had a prolonged recession since 1990. The Japanese economy has grown. And if you go to Tokyo, any Japanese city, people don't seem to be on their uppers. It's actually, it's not grown as fast as it did, but they've had a financial problem. But anyway, there's obviously a lot of emphasis on the current crisis. And I've looked at the duration and scale of all recessions under capitalism since the late 19th century. And they can occur on any scale. This is true. But I think at the present time, all we can usefully say is that by the evolutionary process, this current one too will pass. The way in which we'll emerge from it will come about through experimentation and evolution rather than by planned design. And capitalism will then go back to delivering higher prosperity, more leisure time, and greater life expectancy. And just think, if you mention in terms of innovation, think of companies that everybody in this room uses. Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, well, some of them didn't exist 15 years ago. That's the innovative and evolutionary aspect of capitalism which will take us out of the current crisis. But just a final point, I'm really quite delighted to hear some of the views expressed in the last 10 or 15 minutes. I mean, it's views I haven't heard for a long time. They're making me feel young again. So I'd like to propose an experiment. And to say, everybody who, and not just in this room, across the country, is, oh, here's a use, I'm willing to pay taxes for this, right? So people who feel, socialists or anti-capitalists, I'm quite happy to have my taxes say, let's take a big county, say, like Yorkshire, and we'll buy everybody of Yorkshire out, and they can come and live with us, and for me that will be a really big sacrifice to make. And then all the socialists and anti-capitalists can go and live in Yorkshire for 10 years. And I'm quite happy, at the end of the day, when they come with their begging bowls, when they're on their uppers, when they're on the verge of starvation, I'm charitable, I'm not a Catholic, I'm a Protestant, but I'm religious, I'm willing to help them out. Thanks.
Okay, socialism in one county. Before we thank the panel, can I just point out that Foyle's bookshop is open downstairs, selling many of the speakers' books. That's that. So thank you very much for all the speakers, and thank you to you.